Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America, online, thisweekinamerica.us. Aviation and my 58-year career in air traffic control is about aviation history, the pilot, behind the scenes, the air traffic controller. The aircraft controller in this case, and author of this fascinating book, is Cecil Miller. The book covers 1900 to 2050, starting with the Wright brothers and the early days of the airplane manufacturers, airplanes, the beginning of airmail, the pilot heroes during the war, test pilots, the jet age, flights into outer space, and what the future could well be like. Cecil joined the Air Force in 1955. He worked in the control tower at Edwards Air Force Base, California, during the jet age, the race to the space, the Cold War, and the original 7 astronauts. In 1960, he joined the FAA, working in control towers in Indianapolis, Lansing, Kansas City International, Dallas-Fort Worth, the FAA Headquarters in D.C. After retirement, he was a contractor supporting FAA needs, retiring in 2013. Cecil Miller, author of Aviation and My 58-Year Career in Air Traffic Control, joins us on This Week in America. Cecil, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us.
That's nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Love the book, and there's so many stories. We'll get to some. The others you'll have to buy the book to thoroughly enjoy. And you start off right off the bat with the foreword, and you've got 2007, 3 incidents in where it was quick thinking on the part of air traffic control and the pilots that avoided disaster, in some cases like literally a few feet from disaster. Talk a little bit about that and the close calls that you were involved in.
Oh, well, I'm not sure it was, I wouldn't term them close calls. That's our job, is to not have close calls.
Exactly, and that's a separate definition. So when tense situations like those that you talk about in 2007, where it took some quick thinking to avoid a problem.
Right. Working in busy facilities, and all facilities have busy times. So the difference is that your busy facilities, you're just kind of busy all the time. And real estate is such a precious thing. You run the aircraft on final 3 miles apart. Unless they see the aircraft they're following, then you clear them for a visual approach. And if they wanted to snug up a little, they could, which would be safe. It would be no problem. But for the controller, you get less than 3 miles separation, and they have what they call conflict alert goes off. And of course, the controller doesn't want that because you're called on the red carpet and so forth. So you have to know your outs. Okay, what do you do if you're running, 3 miles apart, and the pilot is maybe speeding a little bit and they're snugging it up? Then you have to revert to your other options. Like, for example, if aircraft are diverging 15 degrees, whether or not just going right in. So, you have to, that's what your training is for, and you pretty well take it all in stride. But there's times when, like one time I recall reading about, I wasn't involved. There was an aircraft at Louisville, and he taxied out, and they had some closures on taxiway and so forth. But he got out to the runway and said he was ready to go, and they cleared him for takeoff on runway 22, and he actually took off from runway 27, which was a short runway and not long enough for his type of aircraft, and it crashed. So, there are just so many things that can happen. And so the controller not only responsible for his own action, you keep an eye on the pilot and ensure that they, that they're following instructions and
yes.
So
you talk about in the book is Aviation and My 58-Year Career in Air Traffic Control. Cecil Miller is our guest in the program. You'll find the book at pageturner.us in the bookstore. I'll read off where the book's available here in a few seconds. It's interesting. You talk at the book about, for example, at LAX, and I've done this, where you look out and you see this progression of landing lights as far as you can see. Talk about that and juggling, because as you say, if a pilot maybe does something, they're a little slow, they're a little fast. This really is sort of a symphonic orchestra you're conducting, isn't it? As you're bringing all of these in, and at the same time, you've got takeoffs going on.
But what's amazing is at nighttime, as you said, you look out on final at any busy airport, Kennedy, LaGuardia, DFW, Chicago, LA, and it looks like a stair step of lights.
Yes.
The further out you go, the higher above the ground they are. And in, on one of the pages there in my book, I show a picture of ASDI. It's an aircraft situation display, and it shows all the targets in the air. And you get off work and you go out and walk to your car, look up at the sky, and see how many airplanes you see. Probably none. So you think Cecil Miller didn't know what he's talking about. There's no airplanes up there. But you look on the radar and they're up there, believe me. And while we're on that subject, I might mention that because I write about this too, there was two occasions. One was the air traffic controller strike, PATCO strike in 1981.
Remember it well, yes.
Yes, and that was Reagan was president, and Reagan made the comment to the union, and he said, "Come back to work or you're fired." Well, some did and some didn't. And I was the supervisor at Dallas Fort Worth at the time. So we didn't know how many people would show up at our facility, let alone at LaGuardia or Monroe, Louisiana, or whatever facility it was. And when I was in Washington for 2 years, or take that back, I was in Washington for 8 months prior to that, and I worked with a guy that was on detail to the contingency plan, so I knew what their plan was. And since we didn't know how many facilities were affected, we put all the airplanes on the ground at the closest airport. So if you're going from Kennedy to LA and you're in Missouri, you're going to land in Missouri. You're going to go to the quickest airport. And of course, a lot of the pilots didn't like that, and a lot of the passengers didn't either. But we put all the airplanes on the ground in an hour and a half. And the only airplanes were allowed in the air was the ones we controlled, the military. And then we went through the same exercise in 9/11. When 9/11 happened, they had aircraft hit the towers, and one went into the Pentagon, and then one was en route and made a 180 back over the state of Pennsylvania, and the passengers became, what's going on here, and they got it figured out, and they brought the airplane down, and it crashed into Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And they think that aircraft is headed toward the White House, but I guess we'll never know. But once again, was that all? Was there just the three? Was there more airplanes? So we didn't know. And so we put all the airplanes on the ground as quickly as we could. And once again, we had all the airplanes on the ground except military in about an hour and a half. So, to go through those type of things, it's, and then when you walk out off work, it's just something you carry to yourself. You don't really talk about it much to family. It seemed like nobody really understands, what you went through, and it's hard to explain that. So you just, just live with it. And when I was at Edwards Air Force Base, that was a test base, and it was, I think, kind of similar to the test pilots. The test pilots back in those days, they didn't. Today they work things out on a computer and kind of have an idea of what that airplane could do and not do and what restrictions. But back then it was just fly by the seat of your pants, and the test pilots had to be engineers. And the reason for that was they could talk, engineer talked when they got on the ground, and say, okay, you know, you need to do this to make this change and whatever. There was one problem they had that give everybody fits, so, and that was Chuck Yeager in 1947 was the first man to go above the speed of sound, Mach 1. And but he broke the speed of sound. He said it was just real rough. And then once he got through that period, it just smoothed out. And so you just stop and think about how an airplane maneuvers with the rudder, aileron, and so forth. It's by the force of air. And when you get above the speed of sound and there's no air, it was altogether different, and they weren't expecting that.
Yes.
Chuck Yeager, not on that flight, but on another flight, he lost 47,000 feet because he encountered what they termed initial coupling. And they lost control of the aircraft, but he was able to bring it under control and made a safe landing. And I worked in 1956, the X2, and it was the first aircraft to go above Mach 3. And the pilot was well versed on, okay, and this was supposed to be the last flight of the X3 or the X2, because the next was going to be the X-15. And anyway, Captain Apt thought, because of his speed, he thought he was leaving his restricted area, and he made a tighter turn than normal back toward Edwards. And when he did, he encountered inertial coupling, lost control, and we lost him and the pilot both. And so they did make improvements. Like, for example, they thought they had it made you could eject the canopy. So you eject the canopy if you lost control, and you just let it fall down to about 15,000 feet, and then you punch out of it like you would a jet. And he was able to separate the nose cone and the cockpit, but he wasn't able to get out of it. So, you know, and I was, like I said, working in the tower, and we're listening to the test frequency, so we knew what was going on, or as much as they did. You know, when you see the black smoke, is that the fuselage of the aircraft? Is this the nose cone? Is this, you know, the pilot? What is the smoke? And so I contacted the crash equipment was standing by, but not at that location. And I gave them the location, and of course they went out, and he was still in the cockpit. So. But there was a lot of interesting things. You know, there was things that I wrote about, like, you know, because I was curious about the beginning of flight. And
yeah, it's a great history.
Yeah, who knows about, you know, the Wright brothers? And the first flight was actually balloons, and then they went to gliders. And the Wright brothers belonged to a glider club. And the thing that the Wright brothers came up with was control features. They put a motor on the glider, but all it do is, you know, you still couldn't control it. And the only way you could control was you had to lay on top, and you moved your weight on top of the.
Yes.
But, they, you know, I wrote about the problems they had, and one of them went overseas to promote their aircraft, and I think that was like something like 1912, and he encountered a fever, and he passed away. And so, you know, the other brother went on, but in 1917 he sold the airplane. And nothing interesting about that time was, if you ask a lot of people, when was World War I? And most of the answers you'll get will be 1914 to 1918. And if you Google it, it was 1914 and 1918. But the thing that they don't realize, the United States was only in the war from 1917 to 1918. And this was the beginning of, airplanes. And of course, the Army people were, tanks and that type of warfare. And they didn't believe in the airplanes. What do you do with an airplane? And they did use them as to look over the hill. What's on the other side of the hill? What can we see over there? And that type of thing, kind of like a spy plane.
Yes.
So those periods were interesting. And then when the war was over, what do you do with all the airplanes? What do you do with all the pilots? So that's when they came up with airmail. And there was a lot of problems in airmail because they had arrows and airplanes just flying, and they had a lot of mid-air collisions. So that's what really brought air traffic control into the picture.
It's a fascinating history of aviation, and it not only goes back to the Wright brothers, but takes it up to 2050. And Cecil has some thoughts on there on where aviation is going. The book is Aviation and My 58-Year Career in Air Traffic Control. Cecil Miller is the author. You'll find the book available at pageturner.us in the bookstore. And I mentioned this is a republished book and now available for sale in ebook and paperback at its lowest retail price. Available for sale, for example, at all Amazon sites, Barnes & Noble, Page Turner Press and Media direct orders, Chapters Indigo in Canada, Waterstones in the UK, Booktopia in Australia, New Zealand, and a lot more places. And you can find those places by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and linking on. A couple of minutes left in the program. It's gone by way too quickly, and hopefully we can do this again because there's so many great stories in the book that I would like to talk about. I want to talk about the psyche of an air traffic controller. We think of pilots as self-confident, as being assured in their abilities of being cool. That could describe an air traffic controller as well, couldn't it? It takes a special person to do what you did because you're juggling all of the pilot's got one plane. You've got a number of them that you're responsible for.
Well, I take it one step further. As I mentioned, let's see, I was in the FAA, I was in air traffic control for 34 years, and where I actually controlled airplanes, and I was a supervisor for most of those years. And the controllers, as you said, some of them, because they had to be self-confident, so some of them, a little bit cocky and that type of thing, and you had to know, as a supervisor, how to handle that. And you had to know how to handle your people because you wanted the right person in the right place. Like, for example, you had thunderstorms, you had deviation, you had aircraft that couldn't go into their airports and that was coming to your airport. And so a lot of things going on. As a supervisor, you would get this information, but you would staff your positions and you wanted the best people in there. So sometimes that cocky guy was the guy that you wanted in there, and you had to know how to handle that, or you didn't make the other controller feel bad or overlooked or whatever. And so it was really quite a challenge for the controller doing the work. That was also a challenge for the supervisors that were overseeing the operation. And I'll give you one real quick thought. One day at DFW, in the trade, they were just controllers that just went from one position to another, ready for a big surge in traffic. And the supervisor that was in charge of the tower and the radar room was sitting right behind him. And they were talking, and the controllers started getting busy. And normally when you start getting busy, you'll see the controller move up on the edge of his seat, and he's right there, glued. And the two controllers all of a sudden heard a thud. And they turned around and looked behind them, and the person that was the supervisor was talking to was sitting on an instructor's chair. It's a high chair, and he fell off of it. And we called the crash crew there on the airport, and they were there in no time. And they said that the guy had a heart attack, and he said he was probably dead before he ever hit the floor. But what do you do in a situation like that? You know, the controllers, you don't stop the airplanes.
Right.
You know, you just keep going, and those controllers, under those conditions, were continuing to work the traffic, and it was just a lot of things that would happen to cause distractions, but you couldn't allow that to interfere with your work. And,
The book is
I saw
excellent.
the controllers because I've seen some of the best.
So many great stories in the book, Aviation and My 58-Year Career in Air Traffic Control. Cecil Miller, the author and our guest. As I mentioned, a republished book now available for sale in ebook and paperback at its lowest retail price. Available for sale, all Amazon sites, Barnes & Noble, Page Turner Press, and Media Direct orders. Chapters Indigo in Canada, Waterstones in UK, Booktopia in Australia, New Zealand, and a lot more. There's just so much in the book, and again, takes us from the early days of flight, the Wright brothers, up through and into the future. It's an excellent read. And I've mentioned Page Turners a couple of times. Cecil, I know that you've been working with them on the book, getting it back out, getting it read by people. What's your experience been like in working with Page Turners?
It's been tremendous. It was almost like they pulled the plug and everything just stopped, and they give me the utmost attention that they could. For example, I had I wanted to do an audio book. I knew some elderly people that just couldn't manage a book, and there's some people that just don't care to read a book, and there's a lot of people that are traveling and they like to listen to and from work.
Yes.
An audio book. So it's becoming more and more popular. And also in my research, it said that they're better done by the author. In my case, when you kind of like an autobiography. So I mentioned this to them, and they give me all the support that they could. And I did the audio book, and I sent it to them, and they had it all cleaned up, added music to it, and in between chapters is a lady that would introduce the next chapter coming up. It was really impressive and very professional, and I was very proud of that. And also, I had a book that was done in Spanish, and it was interpreted in Spanish, and so I wanted that book published, and can do, and so they helped me get that finished, which was the cover book. I think the cover.
Yes, and it's such a striking cover. The company we're talking about is Page Turner Press and Media. Direct orders is where you'll get information on the book. The website is pageturner.us. Mention two things there as we close the program. The book is available in Spanish, and the book is available as an audio book with Cecil actually reading the book and telling the stories that we've talked about, some on the program, but in great detail in the book. Cecil, it has been a pleasure. So many great stories, so many areas that we can talk about in future programs. Thank you so much for being with us on the program and sharing everything. Excellent book. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for the time. I enjoyed it.
It really was fun. The book is Aviation and My 58-Year Career in Air Traffic Control. Cecil Miller, the guest and the author of the book, available at pageturner.us in the bookstore. Information, of course, at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. And we're back on today's program right after these messages.